Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's virtual program. My name is Andrew Gustafson. I'm from Turnstile Tours. We're going to dive in just a second, but we'll give people a couple of minutes to continue to join because we have a huge crowd today. So first things first, I want to give a big shout out to Open House New York for helping us to organize this program. And I know we have a lot of Open House New York members who are joining us this morning. So thanks so much to everybody for all of your support. The other thing is, sorry, there's a barking dog right outside my door. Yeah, so we're going to dive right in. I just wanted to give people a little bit of info about how you can engage because we really want to encourage you to ask questions this morning or this afternoon, excuse me. So you can do that through the chat. So you see down at the bottom that we have there's a chat box, and so you can engage with Brian and Amanda, my colleagues from Turnstile Tours, are behind the scenes. So feel free to drop questions in there. And so again, we really encourage people to ask questions and engage throughout the program. We have a huge area to cover, a huge topic to cover. And it's not just going to be me talking about it. So we're going to be joined by a couple of my colleagues. So I want to invite them on to say hello. So first, why don't we bring on Stefan, who is going to be co-hosting with me. Hey, Stefan, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
Great, great. So this morning or this afternoon on this program, Stefan and I, we're going to be conversing sort of from the studio. And then we have Cindy, who is actually out in the field. She's going to be on the ferry. The ferry doesn't leave for a few minutes, so she's joining us now from the South Street Seaport. Hey, Cindy, how's it going?
Hi, it's great. It's great. And we're so happy to have everyone here. I'm standing here at the South Street Seaport by the waiver tree. And you can also see there's a preservation barge that's right here for the South Street Seaport Museum. We're really excited to have everyone with us today.
Great. So Cindy is going to be hopping on the Astoria ferry in just a couple of minutes. And so she's starting here at Wall Street. And she's going to go all the way up to East 90th Street, which is the end of the line. So we're going to explore the entire line. And we'll get a little view of the different things that she's seeing. Obviously, we're on a boat. We're out in the middle of the river. So there are places where the reception might be better than in other places. So we will cut away from Cindy at different points in time. And we also have images that we'll be showing that might give you a better view than you can see from the deck of the New York City ferry. So we are going to just step away from Cindy for a minute here as she makes her way over to the ferry landing to hop on board the boat. Yeah, so Stefan, we are going to be talking about a lot of different topics that from the ferry today. It's a really great resource to be able to explore a lot of New York City history from the water, which is a place where we don't often get the opportunity to explore New York City history.
Absolutely. And the East River is such the heart of New York City, running right through as the waterfronts go, the center of the city. It's a dynamic waterway. We'll talk more later about how it's a tidal waterway, not a river in the traditional sense. And as people occasionally discover when they try to go onto it, it's a relatively dangerous piece of water. The currents are quite swift.
Yeah, and of course, historically, the East River has been an industrial waterway. And so we're going to talk a lot about the history of industry. That's also one of our favorite topics at Turnstile Tours. But we will also talk about some of the industry that still remains along the waterfront today, or at least a lot of the infrastructure that really makes the city run.
That's true. Yep. Not just the ferries, but we'll see power plants and neighborhoods that are changing radically, which is true of so many places.
Yeah. We'll also talk about housing. There's a lot of really interesting parts of New York City housing history that you can see along the East River waterfront. As you mentioned, we'll talk about the waterways. We'll talk about the islands that are in the East River. But you can find all of this by checking out the map guide that we created. So just to give you a little bit of background about this program, why we decided to do this. First of all, this is our 157th virtual program that we've done since March. I know many people who are joining today have been on our tours in the past, but we just started giving tours again a couple of weeks ago, but we've mostly been in the virtual realm for the last 7 months. We've done a lot of stuff about the waterways. We've done a few things about barges and ferries and things like that. But for Open House New York weekend, one of the things that we did was put together a map guide. So this is a self-guided experience because there were no in-person experiences for Open House New York weekend. But hopefully some of you got the chance to check it out. And now we're kind of doing this program as a supplement to the map guide that we made. So I'm going to pull it up here, and we'll also drop into the chat the links where you can get access to that. And so here it is right here.
Now, as you're pulling that up, we had a question from Craig, wants to know why the East River is called a river when it's a tidal strait. And I don't have a quick, easy answer to that. I don't know if you do, Andrew, but there are a lot of things that are called odd names that don't really apply. My understanding is that sound typically refers to the waterway behind a barrier island. So the bays of the south shore of Long Island would be Sounds, whereas Long Island Sound is more of a waterway behind the terminal moraine. Even the Hudson River is really more of a fjord for most of its length than it is a river.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And we'll talk about how the East River has also changed. And for a lot of its history, it's very difficult to navigate, especially the upper reaches. So that's one of the things we'll talk about at the end. So here we have this map that we put together here, and we have these different colored panels that represent some of the different themes that we identified. So again, we encourage you to go to our website and you can download this, carry it with you. Maybe some of you are on the ferry right now and are doing this as sort of an audio tour along the way. Yeah, like I mentioned, we'll talk about housing history. We'll talk about the history of barges as well as the use of barges on the East River today. We'll talk about the different islands of the East River and the navigation. And then we'll also talk about some more kind of specific areas, not just broad themes. So we'll talk a bit about the Newtown Creek, although again, that's a topic we could do many episodes of a virtual program just about the Newtown Creek. We will talk about the Williamsburg waterfront. That, along with Long Island City, are some areas that have changed pretty dramatically just in the last 15 years or so. So we'll talk about some of the remnants of that industrial history you can see, and also how that waterfront is continuing to change. And then we will also check out, we'll talk, of course, about one of our favorite places, which is the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so we'll actually, one of the great things about the Astoria route of the ferry is that you get to go into the Navy Yard, go into the Wallabout Bay. So we'll get some good views from in there. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was just to kick things off, was to talk about ferries in general. And a little bit about the ferry history of the East River and of New York City, because this is really where ferries started.
And when you talk about ferries, and you're saying ferries started, are you thinking of ferries as we think of them today, as powered by a propeller, or
exactly? So I'm gonna pull up an image right here in just a second, because when we think about the ferry as a vessel for commuter, this is really where it started. And so NYC Ferry, which only launched a couple of years ago, is really continuing a tradition that goes all the way back to 1814. And where Cindy is going to be getting on the ferry in just a minute is really where it started. And so this was the first steam-powered ferry really in the world, designed for shuttling commuters back and forth. So 1814, we can see an image of it right here. So this is the Nassau. And really, at this time in 1814, New York was a growing city, but Kings County, Brooklyn, across the river, Brooklyn wasn't even a village yet, let alone a city. It was just sort of this little hamlet that had grown up around the ferry. And what the introduction of steam-powered ferries did was really transform it into the first commuter suburb.
This is a curious image. This is the first depiction of the Nassau I've seen where the water wheel seems to be outside, unless they're sort of projecting inside. My understanding is all the images I've seen had two hulls, just like the current ferry, because the hulls protected the water wheel in between them as the ferry came in and out of its slips. It's a really interesting view.
So basically like a catamaran.
Exactly. Yeah. Just like the ferries are today, but for a different reason.
Yeah, and so this would ply back and forth between the area around Wall Street and what we know today as the Fulton Landing. And then from there, it really grew into this massive industry. This is the way people got back and forth across the river, as we can see in this next image right here. So if you look on both sides of Manhattan, this is from 1847. You can see all of the ferry lines going back and forth that really started to knit these two cities together. Or in this case, we had Williamsburg was a separate city, and of course all the places in New Jersey as well. So really using the waterways, as a rather than sort of as a highway, but actually as a crossing point.
And not only because we don't have bridges or tunnels at this time, and we have this archipelago we're living in, but to some degree, this is an easier way to transport large amounts of goods, the same value we had from the canals, like the Erie and the Morris Canal.
Yeah, and of course, we've done a few programs about canals, but yesterday was actually a big
big canal anniversary.
Holiday, anniversary.
195th anniversary of a date called the Wedding of the Waters, when the canal boats that DeWitt Clinton and company took from Buffalo when they opened the Erie Canal arrived in New York and then went down to Sandy Hook, and they took a barrel of water from Lake Erie and poured its contents into the Atlantic, marrying the salt and fresh waters and inaugurating the canal.
Yeah, and of course, we think about the Erie Canal as something that's far away from New York City, but we're actually going to see some infrastructure of the Erie Canal on the program today.
Absolutely, the vast majority of traffic on the Erie Canal that was coming east was coming to and from New York City.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about the ferries is that we have a handful. You can almost think about some of the ferries, especially in this area right over here, and up into Williamsburg as well, as sort of extensions of streets. We have ferries that it's the same name of the street on both ends. So, for example, the Grand Street ferry goes from Grand Street in Williamsburg over to Grand Street in Manhattan. And so in many ways, the ferries, even before the bridges, were a way to sort of extend the street grid of Manhattan into Brooklyn.
And if you think about it, if you have enough ferry service, we see sometimes the ferries, NYC ferries, waiting for their turn to dock. If you have enough ferry service, eventually they stack up and become a bridge.
Yeah, that's true. But speaking of the NYC ferry service, I see that Cindy is about to get on board. And so we'll be cutting back to her in a second. But let's talk a little bit about the current service that we have on the East River. This is something that was gone for a long, long time. Essentially, after the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1885, or excuse me, 1883, the ferry service started to dwindle away, and within 20 years or so, it was almost completely gone on the East River.
Yeah, we did have other ferries operating still, of course, the Staten Island Ferry and ferries to Brooklyn and New Jersey. And there was really only the period of time that we did not have ferries crossing the Hudson was relatively short. But this particular ferry, given its historic importance, to have that gone for such a long time is pretty notable, and its return is as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so we had ferry service sort of come back to the Hudson River back in the 1980s with New York Waterways, which is still around. I like to say that the last East River ferry service was actually, we used to have a ferry that ran from Bayonne, New Jersey to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so that stopped running in 1947. But yeah, that was kind of the end of it, as you know, not just the bridges, but really automobiles started to uh, dominate transportation. But they came back. So in 2011, we had the relaunch of the East River Ferry. Some of you may remember that service. And so that basically runs on what today we know as the East River Line. And then they put that out for a contract for an expanded service. And so that was launched in 2017. And so the service that you see today, the routes that you see today, and the boats that you see today, you know, are about about 3.5 years old.
It looks like we've got Cindy boarding the ferry and
Yeah.
to leave.
So we'll come back to her in a second. So she's the route that she's taking. Maybe we can go back to this map so you can see here. She is not exactly going to be following the route of the Nassau. She is going to. Sorry.
That and then some. We are going over to Fulton Street.
Well, we're going to skip. So we skip over the Fulton Landing. We go straight to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, as you can see here. So just so you know the stops that we're going to go on. So we're going to first go to the Navy Yard, and we'll cut to Cindy as she's pulling out in just a minute. Then we're going to go up to East 34th Street, then across to Long Island City, then up to Roseville Island, followed by Astoria, a place called Hallett's Cove. And then we'll end at East 90th Street, right next to Gracie Mansion, in fact. And that's when we'll get a nice view sort of the mouth of the East River where it connects to the Long Island Sound, as you can see right here, the Hell Gate. So that's the route that we're going to take. And Cindy should be pulling out momentarily. And the first place we're going to talk about is what's directly across the river. We'll talk a little bit about the area today known as Dumbo and the Brooklyn Bridge before we tuck into the Navy Yard.
There's so much to talk about in this area. You know, this is really the center of New York history in this spot where Cindy is leaving from right now.
Mm-hmm. So we appreciate everybody bearing with us, just as the ferry doesn't always run exactly on time. They have to deal with, like Stefan mentioned, traffic with other boats, with other ferries, and deal with the tides and things like that. So it looks like we're running just about a minute or two late. I should also mention that normally our programs go for an hour. We're going to go for about an hour and 15 minutes so that we can get Cindy all the way up to East 90th Street to end the program. But please drop into the chat again if you have any questions, but also if you have any experiences with the East River, with the NYC Ferry. I see some people have mentioned here that they ride it all the time. Someone here says that they're actually I'm sitting right next to the Hunters Point South Ferry Landing. So that comes from Merrill. And then we have people joining us from other parts of the country as well. Welcome to Helen from New Haven, which is my hometown. So thanks so much for joining us. And then we have Jane from Brooklyn, John joining us from Fair Lawn. Okay, so Douglas has a really important question, which is, do any of the ferries use Metro cards? The answer is no. And the reason why is because the NYC ferry system is actually run by the city of New York. And the subway system and the bus system is run by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the MTA, which is a city-state agency. So we do not have interoperability between the two systems, which is why you can't use a Metro card or any MTA fare on it. But the cost of a ferry ride is indexed to the cost of a subway ride. So right now it's $2.75 on both systems, although you don't get a transfer. If the subway fare should go up, which I think is coming in the next year or two. Maybe they've delayed that. But say it goes up to $3 and the ferry will go up to $3. If they ever drop the cost of a subway ride, then the cost of a ferry ride would drop as well. But that may just be wishful thinking. Yeah, no, but that's a good question. So they are separate systems because they're run by separate government bodies. Yeah. And so it looks like Cindy is underway. Just so you know, Cindy she's obviously wearing a mask. You have to wear a mask to ride the ferry, just like any mass transit in New York City. But that's also a nice wind guard for her microphone. So she has her microphone tucked into her mask. But let's check in with Cindy and see how she's doing. You can see the image here is okay, but it's a little grainy at points. Cindy, can you hear us? Oh,
if you can, we can't hear her yet, but we've gotten a great view
that's
there.
okay. But we get a nice view here of the Brooklyn Bridge. So in many ways, like I mentioned before, this is the bridge that kind of killed off the ferry traffic in the East River. I do like to mention the fact, though, that the ferries kind of got their revenge. Because when the Brooklyn Bridge was being planned, they basically built the span over the route of the Fulton Ferry. And when John Roebling, the designer of the bridge, was scouting that route, he actually slipped off a ferry and his foot got caught in between the ferry and the dock and it crushed his foot. He was a believer in something called the water cure, sort of some 19th century quackery that you could cure any disease just by running fresh water over it. And he got a lethal case of tetanus and died. So it was his son, Washington, who completed the project. He also, of course, suffered greatly from the bends from the construction. That's a whole other story. But I like to mention that the Brooklyn Bridge killed off the ferry, but the ferry has really killed off its designer, John Roebling. So here we are now. You can see a little bit from Cindy. We're just sort of pointing into the sun. This area, Dumbo, literally down underneath the Manhattan Bridge overpass, which we just passed under. And I want to pull up a historical image, which we use a lot on our programs. Which will give us a little bit of a sense of just how active the Brooklyn waterfront was in the 19th century. So Stefan, tell us a little bit about this image that we're looking at here.
Oh, this is a lithograph that was distributed by the Courier Knives Company. And what we're seeing here is it may be difficult to recognize because in no small part because the Governor's Island is a very different size than it is today. That's the little island in the bottom right. So you see by the Brooklyn Bridge on the left that we're looking at the Brooklyn waterfront, aiming directly at Brooklyn Heights. And on the waterfront, you see a wall of brick buildings. These are warehouses. Some of them have grain elevators distributing grain from the Erie Canal. In the upper left, we see the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But for where we are right now, the key piece are these warehouses, this walled city of where goods were brought in from all over the world in exchange with goods from all over America, including cotton, which was our #1 export, brought up here from the South and then sent primarily to Liverpool for processing in the mills of the north of England.
Yeah, and of course, having all of these warehouses along the Brooklyn waterfront, it moved over to the Brooklyn in part because the Manhattan waterfront was filling up. And it also was in close proximity to all the people that were trading those commodities, namely Wall Street.
Yeah, with one of the great advantages of New York City is that it has such an extensive waterfront. We typically refer to it as 520 miles of waterfront these days, although I think Robert Moses calls it 574. But and not only that, but our tides are very moderate. So all you have to do to have a place to moor a boat is to stick a pier out into the water till it gets deep enough. And it will range between 5 and 6 feet over the course of a day, nothing more than that.
So we're going to go back to Cindy's view in just a second. I see some comments in the chat. some people are having a little bit of trouble seeing our view or seeing the images. If you're joining us on a mobile device, you may just have to swipe right or left, and that actually pulls up different views. If you're joining us on your computer, you should just have typically one view, which is, you know, either the shared screen or the gallery view of us. But again, if you have any technical issues, Brian and Amanda are there to help you. Okay, so I'm going to stop the share here, and what we're going to do is we're going to spotlight Cindy's view as she pulls into the Wallabout Bay right here. Sorry.
While you're working
Okay.
on that, we had a question about boathouses on the East River. We'll get into that when we get closer to Astoria, but thank you for your question. I did want to acknowledge that.
So we don't have the best reception in the Wallabout Bay. We tested this out earlier this week, but I did want to show you this one thing that we're pulling up on. Then we're going to pull up some more images of the Navy Yard. So what you can see sort of in the center of the screen, right in the middle there, is the home port of the NYC Ferry system. So the Brooklyn Navy Yard sort of serves a dual purpose in the ferry system. On the one hand, it has a stop on the Astoria route. On the other hand, it is the home port. So whenever the ferry boats finish their route, they come in here. This is where they get fuel provision. This is where, if you work for NYC Ferry, if you're a deckhand, this is where you come to work every day. This is where they provision them with, food and beverages, although they've suspended that service during the pandemic. And then you can sort of make out there's actually a boat out of the water. They do have a small boat yard there. So they have what's called a travel lift, so they can lift those boats out of the water and do basic repairs on them. These boats are all made out of aluminum, so they're very, very, very light. They were all made down in the South. Some were made in Alabama, some were made in Louisiana. A company called Horizon Shipyards, another one called Metal Shark. So that's a big center of the shipbuilding industry. So here you can get a better view now of those ferry boats. So they have berthing space for over 20 here, and then on another part of the Wallabout Bay, we may be able to spot some more ferries that are docked here as well. So in many ways, like I was mentioning before, a lot of areas of the East River, the Brooklyn Navy Yard included, are sort of the back office of the city. Much of the infrastructure that really makes the city run, often the infrastructure that you don't exactly think about every day, you can find along the waterfront. So behind it, you can actually see that there's a power plant. That's a Con Ed power station, not the last power plant we'll see on the tour today. And then in the foreground, you can maybe make out some concrete tanks along the way, which are the Red Hook wastewater treatment plant, which is inside the Brooklyn Navy Yard and is not in Red Hook. But it does service, Red Hook is within what's called its sewer shed, so its service area.
And you were just talking about shipbuilding. That's a significant spot in the history of shipbuilding, where those tanks are.
That's right. So that's where the ship ways used to be. So this is where we would launch ships at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So a little bit of background about the yard. If you've joined any of our programs or our tours, you probably already know a lot about the yard. But for those who this is maybe a new space to you, this is not a Navy Yard. So this is not owned by the Navy or the federal government. This is an industrial park owned by the city of New York. So the Navy Yard itself was opened in 1801, operated up until 1966, when it was decommissioned and sold to the city of New York. And so it's a 300-acre campus. It has over 70 buildings, again, all owned by the city. And there's over 500 companies that call the Navy Yard home. One of them is a company called GMD Ship Repair. So you can see the crane in the middle there. and that is where one of our dry docks are located. So while we're docked here, I'm just going to pull up a couple images here that we can take a look at so you can get a closer view of the Navy Yard and what it looks like, because we can't actually go over to the dry dock right now because we got more spots to see along the ferry route. Okay, so here's just an aerial view of the Navy Yard, and Cindy is right here. So that's where she's docked right now. And then over here on the left-hand side, that's where the home port is. So this photo is a few years old. We've added quite a few more buildings to the yard and more facilities. But so the whole yard sits around this bend in the East River called the Wallabout Bay. This is dry dock number 1. So dry dock 1 is the third oldest dry dock in the country. It's a ship repair facility. So today we don't build ships at the yard anymore, but it is the largest ship repair yard in the region, where we have 3 working dry docks. And we often work on commercial ships, and occasionally we also get ships of the US Coast Guard, which you're seeing here. We even get ferry boats as well. So we have yet to service in the dry docks any of the NYC ferries. This is, if we have any people from Long Island or Connecticut, this is one of the ferry boats that goes between Bridgeport and Port Jefferson across the Long Island Sound. Now that seems pretty far away, but there are limited shipyard facilities that can do, this was actually an emergency repair, but there are limited places where they can turn around a project like that quickly. And so this was here about 3 years ago after it ran into a pier by accident. And then, so dry dock 1 is about 350 feet long. We also have 2 1,100-foot long dry docks designed to accommodate aircraft carriers. So these are as big as the dry docks you might find down in, Norfolk, Virginia. But this is dry dock number 6 and dry dock number 5 right here. Cindy is going to be pulling out in just a second. It looks like we just lost her video feed in a minute. Like I said, Wallabout Bay doesn't have the best reception. But these dry docks right here are still used today for repairing all kinds of ships. We get, large ocean-going barges and tugboats. The boat that we just saw here a minute ago, it was a ship of the National Defense Reserve Fleet. So if you don't know what a dry dock is, I keep saying this term over and over again. This is actually basically a big bathtub where we can get ships out of the water. Yeah, so we're obviously still a very active port. And so we have a lot of ships that come in and out of New York, and we need a place to repair them. And so the Brooklyn Navy Yard, still serves that function.
Andrew, one of our listeners, our viewers, brought up some of the Navy Yard history that is definitely worth mentioning. Craig notes that this was the site of the prison ships during the Revolutionary War, and which was a horrific chapter in the history of Wallabout Bay. For those of you who don't know, we're looking at a place where ships that were moored semi-permanently in the bay, and Revolutionary War soldiers from America were held there in just abysmal conditions. There are a lot of bodies still buried in, they've discovered quite a few bodies in Vinegar Hill. A lot of those got moved to what's now Fort Greene and the Martyrs Monument there. But thank you for mentioning that, Craig. It's a very
absolutely. So, the idea of creating this guide was to encourage people to not just ride the ferry, but get off and visit places adjacent to these various ferry stops. And so one of them is at Fort Greene Park. It's just a couple of blocks from where the ferry lands. You can also check out Building 77. So this is one of the industrial buildings it's one of the industrial buildings built during World War II that's been completely remodeled for manufacturing space, office space, and it does have a retail space on the first floor. It's called the Food Manufacturing Hub. And so here you can visit a New York City landmark, Russ and Daughters. It's not only a retail store, it's also their commercial bakery. So anywhere you go in the city and have a Russ and Daughters bagel or babka or bialy, this is where it's made. And I just wanted to mention real quick, we also have our visitor center and museum, building 92, not currently open in the main galleries, but we do have the temporary gallery is open right now. So you can visit the Brooklyn Navy Yard website to find out more, as we're trying to slowly reopen. And then of course the heart of the Navy Yard is manufacturing facilities. So this is a company called Farah Designs that makes architectural metalwork. Scott Jordan Furniture, who we did a program with earlier this year, that makes really nice solid wood furniture. So those are some of the places. And again, on the guide, you can read more about the different places that you can visit. So, most of the Navy Yard is off limits to the public, but there are a lot of different areas around the perimeter, especially, that you can check out. You can go visit Wegmans as well if you want to go shopping. But let's cut back to Cindy here, who is coming out of the Wallabout Bay, I believe. How's it going, Cindy? Can you hear us? Cindy, we can't hear you yet, but that's okay. So we're coming out now back into the channel of the East River, and what you can see there are these big piles of gravel. So I'm just going to spotlight Cindy. So she's the main thing that you're seeing here.
These are such an important icon, both of our city as it continues to build and also our recovery environmentally. This is, I think, a really important space in our waterfront. Of course, the gravel, a lot of that goes into concrete, which is going into new buildings. And we're shy a pier there. I don't know, you want to tell us more about what happened with that pier, Andrew, the one that we lost?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an important story whenever we're talking about the waterfront in New York City and infrastructure, which is that, we went through a period of time where, the waterfront really went into decline. And this was driven by a couple of different factors, namely containerization. With the advent of containerized cargo, the advantages that New York City had as a port, its huge workforce, its big, collection of warehouses like we saw in Dumbo, that wasn't necessary anymore. What the industry wanted instead was, lots of open space for stacking and storing containers, and they wanted good connections to railroads and highways. We didn't have that in New York, and so the industry started to move out of the city over to places like Newark, Elizabeth, and Bayonne, New Jersey. And so as a result, there was disinvestment from the waterfront. At the same time, as the water got cleaner, we had the return of a lot of maritime pests, namely shipworms. And so a lot of this waterfront infrastructure that was made of wood was infested with these shipworms. And so while at the same time you have people abandoning the piers, the collapse of the piers is accelerating, and they're just falling into the East River. And so that happened with one of the piers at the Navy Yard called Pier G. But you can see the ravages of disinvestment and shipworms, if you go all along the Hudson River, for example, and plenty of places on the East River.
We can see more of the industrial changes that we're looking at in the city.
Exactly. So I'm going to pull up an image here to sort of complement what Cindy is showing us. But what you see directly across the river there with that chimney is the old Domino sugar factory. And next to it, you can see one of the new buildings that's being built on that old Domino campus. So this was really, along with the Brooklyn Navy Yard, one of the industrial titans of the Brooklyn waterfront. Domino sugar, this refinery alone at one point, around the turn of the century, produced about 85% of all the granulated sugar in the United States. So it was known as the Sugar Trust because they had this tremendous monopoly over sugar production. And so this facility, this specific building, actually operated from 1885 up until 2005. And so I want to show you a picture of the changes over time. So at the top, you can see this is what the building looked like, shortly after the company shut it down. And you can see in the background, the main sort of iconic building there, which is known as the Pan Filter and Finishing House. I want to get that right. And so it's that brick building you see back here. And then, of course, the iconic Domino sign. After the facility was shut down, what the city did was they landmarked this building. So they have to preserve the sort of exterior of the building. And they also landmarked the sign, but not the building the sign is on. So the sign will have to be relocated. And if you look at the image at the bottom, you can see in the center the old brick sugar house in the middle, and these other office and apartment towers that are going to be built on the site. So I see a question here from Robert, who asked where the old Pfizer citric acid and molasses tank was located. You can actually, we couldn't catch a glimpse of it today, but it's very close by. You'll see a lone chimney along the waterfront in Williamsburg. It's actually next to a small power plant, and there's a little park right there. And that's where one of the very, very oldest Pfizer plants was. They'd eventually build their major plant over in Bedford-Stuyvesant along Flushing Avenue. But yeah. So another thing to keep your eyes peeled for. We didn't drop it on the map. I'm just noticing, but that's definitely something I've pointed out on boat tours before. Another building I just wanted to mention that you may have caught a glimpse of that Cindy went past, which is the Austin Nichols and Company building. This is a building close to our heart because it was designed by Cass Gilbert, who designed the Brooklyn Army Terminal. And this is in many ways sort of a prototype for the Brooklyn Army Terminal, a reinforced concrete building that also you could drive trains directly into it. It was a grocery distribution warehouse, and now it's apartments. But let's take another look back at the Brooklyn waterfront with Cindy. And again, keep your questions coming. This is great. So Stefan, tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here.
Right, so we're working our way up through Greenpoint and coming up on the mouth of Newtown Creek will be coming into view soon. But before we get there, it's important to note our approach to Bushwick Creek. A lot of the old waterways have gotten either covered over or obscured with the development, and Bushwick Creek has an important role both in our future as a park and in our past as a place of industry.
And it's just a little bit south of where we're looking at here. So we're looking at Greenpoint right now, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And so just a little bit to the south of this is maybe right where we can see those sort of low rise area to the right is like you mentioned, Bushwick Inlet. Now I mentioned that all of this waterfront was transformed just in the last 15 years. And that transformation was really driven by rezoning in 2005. And as part of that rezoning to allow high-rise residential in place of all this industrial space was a promise to build a park around Bushwick Inlet. That promise has not been fully realized yet. There have been a lot of obstacles to purchasing the land and, challenges with the city budget, the financial crisis, things like that. And so hopefully we will have that park because there's so many more people now that are living on the Brooklyn waterfront and a real dearth of green space. So it's a challenge, and we hope that it gets, that park gets completed.
On the other hand, we're on the left. We'll get a better look at this in a minute, but we do see a park that has opened and has residences built on it over there at Hunters Point, and we'll get into the Gantry State Park as well, Gantry Plaza State Park. This whole area, we're basically looking directly at the mouth of Newtown Creek, which, as we mentioned before, could be several shows on its own with the tremendous amount of industry there. Still today, there's some, but a lot of that's changing quickly, and great parks are being built in there with the Barge Terminal Park playground on the right. And again, we'll get a closer look at this later. We're almost, it looks like we're actually maybe stopping at the 34th Street stop in Manhattan. It feels like we're quite close to that here. Yep, there we are.
Yeah, that's right. So that's why we're getting further away from the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront. But yeah, I mean, the Newtown Creek is an interesting example because it's obviously, there's a lot of development, especially at the mouth of the creek. but it's still very much an industrial waterway. There's still a handful of industrial users on it, and again, a lot of it is sort of the back office of the city. So we have the city's largest wastewater treatment plant is on the river or on the creek, and so it's used for moving material. And then we also have one of the city's largest recycling plants is along there as well.
I have to say, my favorite thing on Newtown Creek right now is the waterfront access that they've built around that wastewater treatment plant, which they're extending. But it's an incredible place to connect with the water. You can go right down and touch it if you so desire, although Newtown Creek is also one of the most polluted waterways in New York City. So maybe avoid that, especially if it's recently rained.
Yeah, and of course, we can't talk about Newtown Creek without talking about the environmental challenges, really because it was such a heavily used industrial waterway, and it was really the center of the city's petrochemical industry. As Cindy is waiting at the dock to pull out, I'm just going to pull up another image here. So we should mention, the history of going back to Bushwick Inlet. That's where the USS Monitor was built. It is a commonly held myth that the Monitor was built at the Navy Yard. It was actually built a little bit up the river at the Continental Iron Works in the Bushwick Inlet. And here's the Bushwick Inlet Park as it would be completed and realized, not quite yet.
Someday.
This is what I want to show you here, which this is a map from 1909 that shows the industry along the Newtown Creek. So you can see there's still large areas in black, areas still to be developed, areas slightly developed, fully or nearly fully developed. And again, a lot of that was the petrochemical industry. And so there was a leak of underground fuel storage tanks that was undiscovered for decades. And it's believed to be, one of the largest oil spills in the United States. And so as a result, the Newtown Creek is a Superfund site, and those companies have been doing remediation, to, pump out that oil and also do remediation of the soil and the water that's been contaminated. So it's a huge environmental challenge. Obviously the other
piece of history. I've spoken with one of the archaeologists working on that project, and they are finding things in the canal and try to date when the oil, who caused what mess. And so they're going through the layers of debris, and there are quite a few in the bottom of the canal to help figure out who has to pay for what.
You also notice that there's a cemetery there, still there, Calvary Cemetery. And speaking of ferries, there actually used to be a ferry you could take from Midtown Manhattan that would take you up the Newtown Creek to go to the cemetery to visit your loved ones there. So it is also an example of building our cemeteries on what was at the time considered to be a lot of marginal land in New York City. I just wanted to mention a couple. I just wanted to mention a couple of comments here that we got about the Pfizer plant, especially. Someone mentioned that we used to sit at Pfizer Park late at night and watch the sugar boat fill up on the water from the Domino plant. And then another one we had here, is Robert mentions about the old Pfizer plant in East Williamsburg in the Broadway Triangle neighborhood. And yeah, many of the buildings are still there. Some of them being redeveloped as sort of multi-tenant industrial buildings, including the main building on Flushing Avenue. So you can see here, Cindy is pulling out from East 34th Street right here. And again, there's so many things to look at the Manhattan skyline, but I always find the Brooklyn skyline to be more interesting. I'm going to zoom in on Cindy here so you can get a closer look at those brown buildings that are right in the middle, just to the left of the United Nations building. A really interesting set of buildings called Tudor City. So they're right there in the middle. And what really, these were built in the 1920s. And what really always strikes me every time I go past Tudor City on the ferry is that if you look at the two buildings on the right, so there's these three brown buildings there. The two on the right, they have these little tiny windows. And that kind of doesn't make any sense. You know, if you have a building that's right on the river, don't you want a waterfront view? But 100 years ago, nobody wanted a view of the East River. The East River was an industrial waterfront. What was directly behind the building was an abattoir, a huge slaughterhouse complex where, you know, effluent was being dumped into the river. No one wanted to look at that. And so instead, the back of the part of the building that faces the river is these little tiny windows for elevators and you know, storage rooms and stuff. But the main apartments face into the city, which is kind of the opposite of what we see today with development. So it's just an interesting example of how the city has really turned again outward, turned to really engage with the waterfront in ways we haven't had before. We had another question, which is about the building we can see just sort of on the left edge of the image, or now it's coming into the center, which is those two sort of curved buildings with a sky bridge in the middle. That's the American Copper building, built just in the last few years. So that's a residential building. I believe, I've never been inside, but I know that it has been part of Open House New York a few times. And that building, I think it has an infinity pool in the middle, in that sky bridge that runs between it. So a little bit outside of our housing budget to live there. A couple other comments we had here. So Daphne, that's an answer to your question about the slanted building. Someone else also mentioned, as we were talking about Calvary Cemetery, that they used ferries to carry away people who died in the flu pandemic in 1918 and 1919.
And we had a question about Untitled Island, which we can almost make out if we.
Yeah. So we can just kind of see it in the middle. Right there. It's a little bit hard to make out, but basically the island is just opposite the United Nations. So we can see on the far right of the screen there, which is the very southern tip of Roseville Island, and then Untitled Island is sort of on the left-hand side, of course, named for the former General Secretary of the United Nations, and built like a lot of islands in New York City, with construction debris. This is actually made from material that was excavated during construction of the tunnel that's now today used for the 7 train. So it was dumped out there. Just like if you go to Governor's Island, you know, more than half of the island, or almost half of the island, is made from debris from the construction of the Lexington Avenue subway. And there's some other examples too, right, Stefan?
Oh, it's a fascinating part of New York history. Places that have been built out with landfill. My personal favorite place that's built out with landfill is Calvert Vaux Park, which is not a well-known park over at the end of Coney Island Creek on the Gravesend side. That landfill came from the construction of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and so it includes debris from the buildings of old Fort Hamilton and from that neighborhood, not the fort itself. So if you know anything about brick makers, another piece of great New York history, as you go up the Hudson River, well, the brick makers tend to stamp their bricks with their brands, and there's a great diversity of different brick makers work in the rubble at Calvert Vaux Park.
Cindy, if we could just take a peek at that sign again, which is, again, we didn't preserve the building, but we preserved the signage. Like with Domino, we have the PepsiCo sign. This one dates back to the 1930s. Is that right, Stefan?
That's right. Yeah, 1939 is the date that it was built. I think it was actually installed in 1940. That was on top of a big bottling plant that stood there for quite a long time. It was in rough shape by the 90s, and when it was fully restored and then incorporated into the park in the early aughts.
And we'll talk more about Long Island City, but as we're coming up on Roosevelt Island, I just wanted to point out this sort of long, thin, gray triangle you can see, the southern tip of the island. This is Four Freedoms Park. And then just to the north of it, you can see this, what looks like a ruin. That's the Renwick Hospital. So tell you a little bit about these things. So, Four Freedoms Park was built just in the last few years, but a design that goes back to the 1970s, designed by Louis Kahn as a memorial park to Franklin D. Roosevelt. And the position was chosen because it's directly opposite the United Nations. But Roosevelt Island itself has such a fascinating history. Again, something we could do an entire program on. But Stefan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the early history of the island and how it's changed over time.
Sure. Well, it used to be called Blackwell's Island, and in its early history, it was used for farming. Later, as a lot of the islands near Manhattan, and an issue we can all speak to today, it was seen as a safe, convenient place to keep people that we needed separated from the rest of the population, particularly as a quarantine. So it has had hospitals on it for a very long time, whether we're quarantining people for typhus or for other health issues, or because we're removing them from society because more in an imprisonment sense. It was for a while known as Welfare Island, and the appellation Roosevelt Island is actually a fairly latecomer. It's I think that only dates back to the late 70s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's right. And what Cindy was just showing, you could see those new shiny buildings, which we'll talk about in a moment. That's the Cornell Tech campus. But yeah, this was really a place for a long time where the city, put people that it didn't want to deal with. And so Roosevelt Island, had the Renwick Hospital, the smallpox hospital, and then other public hospitals were built on the island as well. And then in the 1970s is when the state kind of took over the island, created the Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation, and wants to turn it into a model community for housing. And so the housing we'll see some examples of that early housing from the 1970s in a couple of minutes. But back about, I guess it was about 10 years ago, the city of New York, under the Bloomberg administration, held a competition. The competition was for universities to come up with a use of public land for creating a technology campus. And so one of the submissions was from Roosevelt Island and Cornell University, as well as Technion, which is the Institute of Technology of Israel. And so that won. So they got $100 million from the city of New York. And so they've been building out this huge technology campus on the island on the site of what was formerly the Goldwater Hospital. So it's really, bringing a lot more people and activity to Roosevelt Island. Looks like we have a little bit of not great reception from Cindy right now, but she is frozen on the bridge from what I can see. And of course, that is one of the icons of Roosevelt Island, which is the many named bridge that goes over it, the 59th Street Bridge, the Queensboro Bridge, and the now known as the Ed Koch Bridge.
This whole story about islands, and whether it's Manhattan trying to connect to other boroughs by ferries or other places by ferries, or Roosevelt Island being so close and yet isolated, is always about connection. And one of the things I find most sort of astonishing about Roosevelt Island is that bridge used to be able to get a car from Roosevelt Island to that bridge, if I'm not mistaken. But it doesn't look like there's room for an off-ramp. How did they do that, Andrew?
There actually used to be an elevator that ran down the bridge that you could, there were pedestrian elevators, and then for a period, I believe there was a bus elevator as well. But today, the island is basically car free. So you can drive onto the island, but most of the areas you cannot drive around on the island. So again, part of the model community, maybe something that should be replicated in other parts of New York City where you can't drive your car. I know so many people
get off and walk. Yeah.
Yeah, I know so many people have been enjoying the open streets. Not far from where we live, Vanderbilt Avenue in Prospect Heights has had open streets throughout the summer weekends, and it's been so much fun, so nice. For many years on special weekends, they've been opening up Park Avenue, closing it to traffic. So anyway, we can learn a lot from Roosevelt Island. We can also learn from how they handle their garbage, which is a lot of the older buildings are connected by a system of pneumatic tubes where you throw out your garbage, it gets sucked into a central station where it's compacted. And so as a result, there are no garbage trucks on the island either.
I like to think they have fewer rats for that reason too.
Yes. Oh, for sure. Yeah, we talk all the time about, the genius of the 1811 grid plan for Manhattan, but of course it has no alleys. So we have our garbage in front of all of our buildings.
Look at these beautiful brutalist buildings. I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I know it's not for everyone, but I love these.
Yeah, me too. If anyone wants to share, I don't know if anyone is from Roosevelt Island or has been there. Evie mentions that mentions the Simon and Garfunkel song about the 59th Street Bridge, or the Feelin' Groovy Bridge. That's great. And someone else mentioned the bridge that we're coming up to right now, which is the Roosevelt Island Bridge. So this is the vertical lift bridge. So this is a place where you can drive onto the island, but of course you then have to park your car in these cavernous parking garages they have on the north end of the island.
It's a bridge that doesn't get a lot of use in its lift. It basically only has to go up and down for traffic when the West Channel is closed, and it's really only closed when the General Assembly is at the United Nations. So it's a very expensive bridge to maintain, basically for 1 week out of the year.
Right. Craig also mentioned, he says, the best view I've seen of Welfare Island and the industrial stuff along the East River comes at the end of King Kong, when King Kong is fighting the biplanes at the tip of the Empire State Building. And then, of course, if you've ever been on the King Kong ride at Universal Studios, what does King Kong attack but the Roosevelt Island tram, which we did not get a view of, but that's another way to get onto the island. So, and for a long time, that was the only way to get on the island. Really, was the, at least from Manhattan, was the tram, until the island was connected by the F train. We see another building that's coming into view with the flagpole on it. Can you tell us about that, Stefan?
Oh, actually, I am vaguely familiar with this building. This one's more your department.
Oh, yeah. So this is the Octagon, which was as you mentioned before, was the mental institution that was on the island, and now it's housing.
So often the case. Yeah, and then Evie asked about getting pedestrian access to the Four Freedoms Monument. It's just a short walk from either the subway station on Roosevelt Island or from the tram. So it's very easy to get to as a pedestrian.
Carol mentions that I used to play softball on Roosevelt Island every week for many years. It was an unusual and quirky place.
Oh, here we are in Socrates.
And Alana says that she went to Cornell Tech, so that's great.
That's fantastic. Yeah, look what we're looking at here. We have entered Hallett's Cove. There's you can see the arms of a sculpture in Socrates Sculpture Park.
Yeah.
And, this is the mouth of the Sunswick Creek.
So this is one of the great places. There's a lot to see and visit that maybe you're not so familiar with at the Astoria stop. So Socrates Sculpture Park is a beautiful little park. And then not too far from there, if you want to explore sculpture more, is the Naguchi Museum, which is a museum not only dedicated to the work of the sculptor Naguchi, but also he designed the museum himself for his work. And they have reopened, again, like other museums, in limited capacity, but it's definitely worth taking the short walk from the ferry over to those two places.
And what we were just looking at a moment ago was the remnants of, I guess we're going back there, is remnants of some Erie Canal infrastructure there. And the Erie Canal, of course, the ditch ends at Albany, but the boats were brought by tug or by steamboat to New York. And by the 1890s, they figured out that the Erie Canal was not making as much money as it used to. It was kind of on the downside. So they doubled down on it and they built the Erie Barge Canal, kind of the expressway version of the Erie Canal, which is what we have today. And to serve that canal and the increased freight they expected, they built a bunch of terminals around the city, 6 of which survived until 1944 and were transferred back to the city. This is one of those 6 prominent terminals. There were also terminals at Pier 6, which is now the heliport down at the tip of Manhattan near where we started. There was one that last I saw was still standing just off, I believe, the Willits Avenue Bridge, or Madison Avenue Bridge across the Harlem River. Last I knew it was operated by the Padded Wagon Moving Company. That's old Erie Canal infrastructure. And of course, the grain terminal in Red Hook, just off the Gowanus Expressway. Those are all remnants of the Erie Canal barge terminals.
Yeah, and again, we did a program about the Erie Canal with our friend Will Van Dorp several months ago, but you can watch that for free on our website. So we encourage people to check that out. I wanted to we'll get back to barges in just a second, but we had a few comments and questions here I wanted to mention. So yes, the tram is open. You can ride the tram these days. John also, of course, mentions the Octagon was the site of legendary Nellie Bly, who investigated it from the inside. Again, there's so much history on Roseville Island. We could do a whole program on it, but thank you for mentioning that, John. We also had a question from Marty about the lighthouse. So we're going to turn back across the channel in a second, and we'll get another view at the lighthouse and talk about why that lighthouse is so important, or was so important. And then Eleanor asked, how long is the walk from Socrates Park? I would say it's no more than 10 minutes from the ferry.
It's very close. And Sybil mentions the Queensbridge houses, which we were very excited to talk about, but we missed the view of it.
Yeah. Again, we have we have probably 60 different things that are on this map. We can't get to all of them, but yeah, the Queensbridge houses are definitely worth mentioning. So sort of in the shadow of the Ed Koch Bridge. And we can see so much public housing along the river, including directly in front of us right now. We have the Astoria houses. Again, we have to remember historically that waterfront views were not valued. The waterfront was a dirty, unpleasant place. And if you wanted a nice, genteel place to live, you didn't want to live near the water. And so this was marginal land. And so as a result, that's where a lot of public housing was built. A lot of it was built not only on the waterfront, but in low-lying parts of the waterfront that were prone to flooding, something that we saw, with really tragic consequences during Hurricane Sandy, with the incredible, devastation in the Red Hook houses especially. But yeah, so these areas like, Astoria, like Queensbridge, where we have some of the largest public housing projects in the city, this was marginal land. It wasn't valued for its waterfront views. I should mention too that
it's anywhere there was wet feet. If you had to add land before you could build on it, those were the places that were available. So it became public housing, and it's still wet. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And the Queensbridge houses are actually it's the largest public housing development in the United States. So we're coming back, and now we get a view of the lighthouse right here. So tell us, Stefan, why did they need a lighthouse at this spot in the river?
Well, we're about to come to one of the most dangerous pieces of water in America, called the Hell Gate, appropriately enough. It twists, it turns, it's got incredibly fast currents. It's full of rocks, a couple fewer than it used to be full of. And once you've made it through the Hell Gate, the next thing you have is a wedge facing you, Roosevelt Island. So avoiding the tip of Roosevelt Island is just one more hazard on top of all the ones you've come through. So that's a very important place to have a light. You're caught between the choice of, you have to thread the needle between Roosevelt Island and Gracie Mansion, which you see in the trees there on the right. The reason that we have these incredibly powerful tides is because the East River and Long Island Sound are both tidal, but the East River is impacted by tides both from Long Island Sound and from the harbor. So we end up with very dramatic differentials in the tide heights and therefore higher speeds. And you can see as we look up the channel there of the Hell Gate, past the Triborough Bridge and the Hellgate Bridge, the rail bridge with the arch there, that it twists and turns. And we're actually passing over the site of, or very close to the site of, I believe it was Flood Rock, which stood right in the center of the channel, making things even tighter and was a terrible hazard until the late 19th century when it was removed in an enormous explosion. Really quite a feat of engineering here at the bottom of Ward's and Randall's Islands.
Yeah, and actually, yeah, in 1885, when they blew that up, it was the largest explosion in history, the man-made explosion up to that point. So the pictures are so, I'll show a picture of it because it's pretty dramatic. I want people to be able to see that. We put a picture of it on the map guide as well. So here we can see all the obstacles in the river here, including Flood Rock and Mill Rock over here. And, oh, if this will cooperate. And this is what the explosion looks like, which is pretty crazy. So October,
quite an event. People lined up to see it. So.
Yep. But Cindy is now pulling into the final stop of our tour here. And again, we get that view where you can almost see three boroughs. We can see the Triborough Bridge. We can see Queens to the right. Manhattan is all the way over to the left, and we can maybe see a little bit of the Bronx. The land that we're actually seeing directly in front of us is actually Randall's Island. And then, of course, you can see the footbridge that goes out to Randall's Island. And then that building right there, you know, speaking about, you know, using islands in the waterfront for, you know, all sorts of city infrastructure. That's one of the city's homeless shelters right there. And then to the left, we can also see one of the marine transfer stations, which is where we bring in garbage that's then loaded onto barges. That was just built in the last couple of years. But right now, Cindy's getting off the ferry. So we've come all the way to the very end. We have just a couple of minutes here. So if anyone has any questions, I'm going to pull up myself and Stefan here.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
yeah,
Cindy.
thanks so much, Cindy. Great job as our camera person today.
Yeah, great to see everybody. Thank you for joining us.
And of course, we have to acknowledge that, yes, there were an enormous number of things that we missed. There's so many topics, so many spots that we passed by and either weren't able to see very closely or just there are just too many things to talk about. And that's really the story of New York's waterways. It's, you know, that's where so much of our history has happened. It's impossible to get it all into one session.
Yeah, that's right.
We did have the question about the boathouses, Muff's Boathouse. The short story on the boathouses is that every waterway in New York was lined with boathouses and in various forms. Public rowing, particularly in the 19th century, was one of the most popular sports in New York. So thank you for for mentioning the Muff's Boathouse in Astoria, one of many boathouses that lined our waterways.
Great. Thank you all so much. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things. If you joined us late, just send us an email at info@turnstiles.com and we will send you a recording. If you're a member, you can watch all of our recordings at any time. So we'll send you a follow-up that'll have some more information about how you can join future programs. We have a number of free programs coming up as well. So we're going to keep doing these virtual programs for as long as we can, even though we're back to giving in-person tours in a very, very limited basis. So thank you to everyone for all of your very, very kind words, wonderful questions. And I hope, you know, we're all feeling a little cooped up. I hope this was at least gives you a little bit of a feeling of being out on the water and encourages you to maybe, hop on the ferry, explore the city a little bit. It's a place that I felt very comfortable, very safe, especially in regards to COVID on the NYC Ferry. So it's a great resource. So thank you all so much, everyone. One thing I want to mention, someone mentioned the Soundview Ferry. Yes, you can take the ferry all the way up to Soundview in the Bronx. Maybe we'll do another segment about that ferry route, but that's a different ferry from the Astoria route. So Cindy is back on the ferry and she's going back to Wall Street now. So, but yeah, and thank you so much, Stefan. That was really, really fun. Really great conversation.
Always a pleasure talking about the waterfront with you, Andrew.
Yeah, of course. So as we head out, we're just going to give you that nice view from Cindy, so you don't have to look at us anymore. But thank you all so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Cindy.
My pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.